Good evening and welcome on this very cold evening to the University of Reading to our second public lecture of the year. We used to run these regularly until COVID hit, and we restarted them this year. And I think just the number of people here today and the over 200 who have registered to be on the live stream, I think highlights how popular these lectures are, and it's great to see so many of you here. So I think that the topic of today, all toxic individuals are not created equal, is clearly one that has captured the imagination, probably not just because of recent elections on the other side of the pond, but I'm sure we'll come to this in questions. And as we have a live stream, I need to be careful, given that some individuals can be quite litigious as well. So my name is Dominic Zaum. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor here at the University of Reading. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you, but also to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Holly Andrews from the university's Henley Business School. Holly is Associate Professor in Coaching and Behavioral Change, leads our coaching program at the Business School, and brings a wealth of knowledge from psychology and leadership coaching to this topic. And as she said when we spoke earlier, her day job is to bring the best out of people in many ways through the coaching. Of course, her research interest looks at the worst sides of people in the workplace. So and I'm sure she will bring both of these sides to the public lecture today. Holly will speak for about 40 minutes, so we have plenty of time for questions. We also have questions we will take from the live stream at the end, so I will come back and share those. I think we have an exciting hour ahead of us, and so without further ado, I hand straight over to Holly.
Thank you, Dominic, and welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming out on this very cold, dark November evening. Hopefully I will warm your hearts with tales of toxic individuals as we go through this evening. So this is my research passion, the dark side. So some things that I'm going to share with you this evening. We're going to have a look at exactly what we might mean by toxic individuals and drill down into that. And specifically, I'm interested in psychopaths. So we'll have a real look at what is a psychopath, who are they? And then, because I'm in the business school, we're going to be thinking about, well, why might psychopaths actually be successful? Naming no names. And my particular area of interest is around, are there different types of psychopaths? Should we be talking about psychopathic types rather than just psychopaths? And we'll finish, it's not all doom and gloom, with what we can do about psychopaths as individuals, in businesses as well. So let's get started. Now, as a researcher, a term like toxic individuals, it's great. We use it all the time. People kind of know what you mean by it. But I actually want to make sure that we've got this nailed down. We know exactly what we're talking about when we're speaking about toxic people. So for me, one of the most helpful models around toxicity in the workplace is something called the dark triad. And this is something that came into the academic world probably the early noughties. There's two researchers, Paul Huss and Williams, who noticed that there were these three personality profiles: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. And they all shared a commonality. So all three of these types of personality, they share a willingness to exploit other people, a lack of care for other people, this dark center, if you will. Now, we're going to focus on psychopaths, but we'll have a little look at narcissists and Machiavellians just for context. So our narcissists in the dark triad, they're the people who think very highly of themselves. Narcissism is all about maintaining an inflated self-image. So narcissists think they're great. They expect other people to think they're great and treat them accordingly. And they're quite prepared to use other people in order to flatter their own greatness. Machiavellians, on the other hand, it's all about getting and maintaining power for them. So people who are high in Machiavellianism, they've got quite a cynical view of human nature, and they're quite prepared to use manipulation tactics to get what they want out of people. And their morality is quite abstract. Ends justify the means for Machiavellians. Doesn't matter what you do in between, as long as the outcome is what you want, it was all fine. If those seem bad, psychopathy is often called the darkest of the dark triad. So let's have a bit more of an in-depth look at who are psychopaths and what can we expect from them. So lots of literature about psychopathy, lots of ideas, but I'm interested, when I've said the word psychopath, what do you think of? And it could be anything. It could be a character trait, some kind of behaviour, a person, real or fictional. What comes to mind? Serial killers, yes. Anything else?
No shame or empathy.
No shame, no empathy. Yes, we're getting these real remorseless people who are quite happy to kill others. This is the standard reaction. I'm very pleased you said that, because otherwise these pictures would be totally out of context. But our media portrayals of psychopaths, our poster boy here, Hannibal Lecter, people who are really ruthless in their use of others. They'll take what they want from them, including their lives. But they can also be quite charming and quite charismatic as well. So this is kind of what we see and what we think of with psychopaths. But from a research and diagnosis perspective, there's a lot more to it than just being antisocial and criminal. So we owe most of what we know about psychopathy to a chap called Professor Robert Hare, who's known as the godfather of psychopathy. I'm not sure whether that's a good title or not, but he seems to be proud of it. So he did a lot of work to actually define and create a measurement tool that gave us a distinctive way of measuring and assessing psychopathy. And he divided it up into 4 domains, so 4 areas. And psychopaths have a good number of traits in each of these areas. So we've got an interpersonal domain. This is how psychopaths will come across to other people, how they present themselves. We've got an affective domain. This is all about what psychopaths feel, or perhaps more accurately, don't feel. We've then got a lifestyle domain. This is how they're going to operate in society, how they choose to live their lives. And we've got an antisocial domain. So this is their propensity towards what most would consider to be antisocial behaviour. And sometimes these domains are grouped together. So interpersonal and affective are often grouped together as factor 1, also known as primary psychopathy. And lifestyle and antisocial are grouped together as factor 2 or secondary psychopathy. And there are 20 traits that sit beneath those 4 domains, and you've got them up here on the screen. So I'll take you through a couple in each domain. We've got that grandiosity. Psychopaths share this with narcissists. They also have a highly inflated sense of self-esteem. Psychopaths think that they're great. One of the questions on the psychopathy checklist that is used to assess psychopathy is, do you think you could achieve anything you set your mind to? That's a measure of grandiosity in this. Psychopaths, interestingly, are also pathological liars. So this isn't just lying for a purpose, like, oh dear, I need to get out of trouble, I shouldn't have done that, let's tell a little white lie here. Psychopaths will quite happily lie for no apparent reason. There's no benefit to them. They just seem to enjoy lying. So that's an interpersonal trait. They'll tell you falsehoods when there's no reason. The affective domain is often what we think of as kind of the core of psychopathy. So somebody said, like, callousness, lack of care and empathy for others. That lack of empathy is often seen as the hallmark of psychopathy and what makes it probably as dark as it's seen to be. So psychopaths have a cognitive awareness of how other people feel. They can understand that somebody else is feeling hurt, upset, distressed, happy, whatever it might be. They just don't have any emotional reaction to it at all. You're never going to see them crying at a film, for example. That's not going to be the kind of thing that a psychopath does. And Harvey Cleckley, a very early researcher, in psychopathy came up with some beautiful phrases. We'll use a couple of them throughout this evening. But here in Lack of Empathy, he said that they know the words, but not the music. So they can understand emotions, and that's very useful to them because it enables them to manipulate people very effectively, but they just don't feel that connection to other people's distress. It has no response in them. They also don't really have a great depth of emotion themselves, so shallow affect here. So they probably aren't going to feel what we consider very deep emotions like love or even hate. What they're going to feel is probably much more surface level. It's going to be quite fleeting. It'll be here and gone again very quickly. In terms of our lifestyle domain here, parasitic lifestyle. Psychopaths are quite happy to live off other people if they possibly can. They are not here to work particularly hard, to put in graft, to pay their dues or anything like that. If they can get it for free, they will. They're also quite impulsive and irresponsible people. They don't tend to have a great deal of anticipatory anxiety, don't tend to worry about the future, and don't particularly care about the consequences. So interestingly, one of the questions on the PCLR around being irresponsible is, how are your children cared for if you've got a psychopath who's got children? Because we know that children of psychopaths are more frequently within the care system and looked after children than children of non-psychopaths. Male and female psychopaths will quite happily abandon their children if it's inconvenient to them to raise them. Finally, we've got our antisocial domain. There is an argument here that actually this domain is an outcome of these traits rather than actually a part of the core personality disorder, but it's still in the diagnostic system at the moment, so we'll leave it there. And we tend to see antisocial traits from very early on in childhood in people who go on to be diagnosed as psychopaths. So you'll see behavioural problems in children. Killing and hurting animals is a particular hallmark in childhood for those who go on to become full-blown psychopaths. Also far more prone to criminal behaviour, and they're quite unusual criminals. They will turn their hand to lots of different criminal activities, so the criminal versatility that you see here on the screen. Most criminals have got a particular kind of section that they will kind of operate within. Psychopaths, they will have a very varied rap sheet quite often, everything from fraud to GBH, whatever it might be in between. So to be diagnosed as a psychopath, you have to be interviewed by a trained clinician who will go through these 20 traits. They'll interview you as the potential psychopath. They'll interview people who know you to build up a picture of your life. They'll also look at corroborating evidence that might be available. So this is usually in the context of the criminal justice system. So we're probably looking at details of any crimes that have been committed. And they'll be scoring each of these 20 traits from 0, it's never present, to 2, it's always present, with obviously a 1 sometimes in the middle. So you get a score somewhere between 0 and 40 ultimately. In the UK and Europe, cut-off scores vary, but they're generally around 25. So 25 and above, you're a psychopath. Anyone want to hazard a guess where there might be higher cut-off scores used? The USA, thank you, yes. 30. You can be way more psychopathic in America before you are a psychopath. So although we have a system, we have traits, we have a way of assessing them, what actually constitutes a psychopath isn't actually nailed down, and it will vary across different contexts. So now we know a lot more about what psychopathy actually is. I'm particularly interested not in those criminal psychopaths, not those who have been sectioned, but those who are living amongst us and operating successfully in society. So I'm really interested in getting an understanding of why psychopaths might actually be successful. Well, first of all, you might be thinking, well, is there any evidence that they are? Well, yes. We know from studies that at least 1% of the general population will have clinically significant levels of psychopathic traits. So look around you. There are about, I don't know, 200 people in this lecture theatre, maybe not that much, 150. So statistically, 1.5 of you are psychopaths. To be considered as a successful psychopath in the general population, though, it's not enough to just be in the general population. You've got to not have had contact with the criminal justice or the mental health system. So you've not been arrested and you've not been sectioned. I don't think that's necessarily what we would all think of as success, perhaps, but that is our definition in academia. Why might psychopaths be successful, though? Psychopathy is quite an unusual mental health condition in that actually it doesn't display any outward signs of mental ill health. In fact, if you were to meet somebody who's psychopathic, you would probably find that actually they display lots of characteristics that we see as being actually quite desirable. So they're probably going to be quite charismatic, quite charming, have lots of self-confidence, be out there doing things, taking risks, things that quite often we admire. If you think about this in contrast to other mental health conditions, so if we think about people who might have depression, they might present as being withdrawn. We've got people with schizophrenia. It might present with delusions, for example, in some presentations of the disorder, or obsessive compulsive disorder. It might be things that we could see behaviours like excessive hand washing or checking, whatever it might be. Psychopathy doesn't have any of this. And Harvey Cleckley gives us a very nice phrase again for this. He calls it the mask of sanity, hence the masks that are on my screen here. But sanity may also be an interesting word to use there, because Robert Hare would say, they're not mad, they are just bad. So it's quite different to other disorders. So if we come back to this idea of success, working in a business school, just not being arrested, that just quite isn't good enough for me. So I'm interested in actually, are psychopaths getting ahead in their career? Our evidence would suggest that possibly, yes, they are. So a recent meta-analysis, so a meta-analysis is a type of study that brings together lots of other research studies and adds all their findings into one pot and sees what comes out. So a recent meta-analysis looking at base rates of psychopathy found that where studies had used a general population sample, the rates were somewhere between 1% and 2%. So if we took all the studies together, average of 1.9%. If we looked at studies where the samples were from organisations, so we sampled people who were working within businesses, corporates, etc., 12.9% had clinically significant levels of psychopathy. So vastly overrepresented. So something is happening here, whereby those with psychopathic traits are able to enter and be successful in organisations, potentially successful. But this brings me to a nice bit of audience interaction of, can you actually think of any examples of people you might consider to be successful psychopaths? And I'll put a caveat on this, that we're not diagnosing people. It's not possible or desirable to do that from a distance. Nice disclaimer there for everybody. But we're thinking, can we think of anyone who might have some of these traits? Everyone just shout all at once, Donald Trump. Yes, Donald Trump is a very interesting character. Dominic, you mentioned the elections, but we can see somebody who is arguably one of the most successful people on the planet at the moment, leader of the free world. We can definitely see grandiosity Does Donald Trump take any advice from anybody else, or does Donald Trump believe Donald Trump is right? Lying for no apparent reason. The mind boggles as to how when you are caught in a lie, just double down on it. It's fine. Carry on. Lack of empathy. I think Donald Trump, in some of the policies, particularly around immigrants, migrants in the USA, really kind of dehumanizing and lacking in empathy. I think a lot of people were very distressed, particularly by the policy that separated children from their parents. That was quite a harsh way to treat people. You've got to have low levels of care for others to probably put something like that in place. Also, failure to accept responsibility. As far as I'm aware, Donald Trump has never taken any responsibility for inciting the violence at Capitol Hill, even though he was indicted for it. Quotes that I've read, it was the Biden administration's fault for this. That could also be seen as very irresponsible and reckless as well. People died in that. We can also see some of these manipulative traits. So the audio tapes coming through of him talking to the secretary of was it Georgia, find me the extra votes and things. We've got evidence of manipulation, and of course, famous Stormy Daniels, promiscuity is on our list of antisocial behaviour. He's reportedly definitely slightly more promiscuous than most American presidents, perhaps. Well, maybe not. But criminal behaviour. He's one of the only American president to ever be actually charged. So, yes, I think Donald Trump, well done, 10 out of 10. And of course, you've got other people as well around him. Elon Musk, for example, has got some interesting traits. But we can probably all think of examples, and we can perhaps think of examples of people that we've come into contact with in our own lives as well, who might meet this kind of criteria or show these traits of psychopathy. A study back in 2009, 94% of managers think they've worked with somebody with a toxic personality. And my experience of doing these kind of talks and speaking to people, most people will be able to tell me about somebody that they've worked with or known in their life who's got these traits. And we can see examples of disgraced business people as well. So we've got Travis Kalanick on the screen here as one of the co-founders of Uber. So Kalanick was accused of sexual harassment, of creating what they termed a toxic bro culture in Uber. And a video of him berating an Uber driver went viral. He really lays into this guy. And that forced his eventual resignation from Uber. But there does seem to be a bit of an issue. So why might that be? Well, the things that we think are actually good leadership traits are not that far away from our dark psychopathic traits. So typically, we want a leader who is able to influence people. You don't want somebody who can't bring people on board, get them to go work with them, all pull together. That's not a great leader. But being manipulative, that's only a little bit further up the spectrum than ability to influence. It's just a more exaggerated form of that trait, potentially. We've also got things like visionary thinking. Well, actually, people who are able to lie very easily, very casually, really good at spinning these stories and getting people on board with them. They're going to be able to do that. We quite often require our leaders to make quite difficult decisions. For example, if you've got to make people redundant in your organisation in order for the business to survive, that's tough. But actually, if you're lacking in emotion and empathy for others, it's quite an easy task for you. You don't really care about what's happening to people. So we've got these traits that are actually quite close to one another. And these kind of traits are particularly valuable when you've got turbulent times in organisations and in wider society, as I would argue we're experiencing at the moment. People who are charismatic and confident, they seem even more effective and, the kind of leaders that we're looking for when things are actually difficult. So our wider environment is creating a nice platform for our psychopaths to enter our organisations. Stick your hand up for me if you've ever had to interview anyone. Lots of people. Great. Is it easy to actually be able to judge what kind of person somebody is in an interview? Got shaking heads. Right. Some people can. Brilliant. That is a skill. It's quite often quite difficult to actually accurately judge people's personality traits in interviews. We've got a situation that is very artificial. People are on their best behaviour. They're going to be giving you their rehearsed lines. And even more difficult for us as interviewers, we've got people with psychopathy who've got no anticipatory anxiety, so they're not going to be feeling the nerves that most of us feel when we go to an interview. In fact, it would have been quite helpful about 5 minutes before this lecture if I'd have been a psychopath as you were all wheeling in for lowering the anxiety levels. They're quite happy to lie to you, tell you what you want to hear in response to your questions, and they're very charming and able to manipulate you. So your job as an interviewer is extremely difficult. You're trying to make judgments about whether they've got the right amount of these traits or are they actually a bit extreme in a situation that isn't great for making that judgment. And it isn't necessarily that these dark traits are always going to be bad either. So they quite often confer some short-term advantages. So if you put people into leaderless groups, for example, people with these kind of traits will emerge as the natural leader and everybody follows them, which is great. But over time, these tend to become weaknesses. They can be kind of like overplayed strengths. Campbell has got a lovely analogy to this. He likens it to chocolate cake. So you imagine a beautiful big chocolate cake. Slice of that cake, it's going to be delicious, isn't it? You're going to really enjoy it. If you eat the whole cake, you're going to feel really sick. And that's a little bit like these dark traits. At first, in short doses, they're going to be quite impactful. But over time, as people acquire more power, they start to show these more, that's when they start to become toxic. So when they're in our organisations then, what kind of red flags, what kind of behaviours do you think they might be displaying? Bullying, thank you. Boasting, yes. Oh, lovely one. Gaslighting people, absolutely, yes. So we're probably going to see kind of three main areas of problem behaviours with our psychopaths. They're going to have difficulty working with other people consistently. So they're not going to be very good at forming teams. They're not going to be sharing resources, information with their colleagues. They're going to actually find it difficult to treat everybody fairly and equitably. They're also going to be quite self-aggrandizing. So I said that boasting, they're going to be taking credit for other people's work potentially. Failure to take any responsibility for things that go wrong. That's probably where our gaslighting is going to come in. It's going to be your fault that something happened. It's never going to be theirs. And they're going to struggle to maintain appropriate behaviours. So we're going to see some inconsistent behaviour, lying. You might see dramatic outbursts if things don't go their way. This might even tip over into our aggression, our bullying, and those kind of behaviours. And this is not good news for organisations. So in terms of the kind of outcomes we see more competition and conflict, far more bullying. So some research in organisations where there weren't corporate psychopaths present, people witness bullying on average about once every 4 weeks. Still not great, But when there were corporate psychopaths present, it was 1.6 times per week. Massively inflated amounts of bullying. They're actually not particularly good at their jobs either. Not because they don't have the skill, but they don't have the inclination to work particularly hard. And they're not great at what we call contextual performance. So, you know, all those extra things that you have to do at work that were never part of your contract, but actually are required to make the organization function successfully. So helping your colleagues, doing that, you know, tidying up bits and pieces. In a university, moving chairs and tables around so that the setup is right for your students when they come into the room. Psychopaths aren't going to do all those things. They're only going to do things that suit them. And sometimes those things are actually counterproductive work behaviours. So things like theft, things like sabotage, things like withdrawal of effort, they're all more likely to do those kind of things. And it's not great in terms of the outcomes for those who work with them. So we know that employees who work with corporate psychopaths report lower mental health, they report lower well-being, lower job satisfaction, and with that, higher turnover rates. And overall, decision-making in organisations with corporate psychopaths isn't as good. They're highly risky decision makers. They can become quite tunnel visioned and focused and fail to take into account kind of wider information when they make decisions. They make less ethical decisions, and they're more likely to engage in white collar crime in organisations as well. And this can have dramatic impacts on organisations. So Enron, a favourite case study for the researcher of psychopaths. So for those who haven't come across Enron, Enron was an energy trading company in America. It filed for bankruptcy in 2001, still remains one of the biggest organisational collapses in the last century. $74 billion lost of shareholder money. 4,000 people lost their jobs. And when we start to look into what was actually going on at Enron, its top executives are doing a lot of very shady things. And in fact, Kenneth Lay, Jeffrey Skilling, and Andrew Fastow were all charged with conspiracy and fraud. Kenneth Lay actually died before he was sentenced, but Jeffrey Skilling served 12 years and Andrew Fastow served 5 years in prison for their part in the collapse of Enron. But within Enron, if we look at actually what happened, these guys were so grandiose. They believed that they knew better than anyone else. There's a book and a documentary film about Enron called The Smartest Guys in the Room, because this is what they thought they were. They were kind of invincible. And they made some really bad decisions. So they repeatedly invested in internet companies after the dot-com bubble had burst, for example, despite getting loads of advice that this wasn't going to be a good investment. Real lack of empathy for their staff. So they had a really interesting performance management system. It's called Rank and Yank. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? So periodically, everybody in Enron would get rated on their performance. And the bottom 10% of people would be fired. And it didn't matter if actually everybody was rated as excellent. If you were the bottom 10% of excellent, you were still getting fired, creating this awful kind of culture of fear and anticipation and really building conflict in Enron. As Enron was losing money through all these bad investments, they took up some creative accounting processes. This is the only time the word creativity is bad, when it's coupled with the word accounting. So they were kind of moving their bad debts into kind of other entities so they didn't appear on Enron's books. But when it became clear to them that they weren't going to actually be able to keep this up and that Enron was going to go under, they did something that was so lacking in empathy for everybody that was involved and so kind of calculated, it's quite unbelievable. They did something that might seem innocuous at first. They changed pension administrators, But this meant that nobody could cash in their shares for 30 days. So they could cream as much money out of the company as they possibly could in that time before it collapsed. And all those shareholders were going to lose all of their money. And The Wolf of Wall Street is up here. Has anyone seen The Wolf of Wall Street? You might think this is, this would never happen. This is not what was going on. Enron, there's a lovely Harvard Business Review article about Enron and some of the things that happened. So one of the most unbelievable things, in board meetings, they would hire strippers to dance and strip on the board table while they're having their board meetings. So what you can see in The Wolf of Wall Street here, perhaps not so outrageous after all. So we've got a scenario here where we know we've got psychopaths. We see that they're able to be successful in organisations, and this can be very bad. Up to this point, I've talked about psychopaths as if they're one homogenous group. But you might be thinking, well, from the start of my lecture, I talked about 2 different factors, 4 different domains, and 20 different traits. So, Holly, what happens if you've got kind of different combinations of those? And you would be quite right to be thinking that, because actually, different combinations of those traits can lead to very different outcomes. So, we know from some research that the factor profiles of successful psychopaths are different to those of unsuccessful psychopaths. They're much higher in those factor 1, interpersonal and affective domains than they are in factor 2, the antisocial and lifestyle domains. But there's not a great deal of research in business that actually looks at the factor and the domain levels. So my own research, I was particularly interested in psychopathic career paths, because I kind of thought, well, we've got these case studies. We see, these people are in business, but how do they get to be there? Is there a psychopathic career path? And I was particularly interested in if different combinations of traits or in different profiles were going to determine what kind of psychopathic career path they had. So I needed a way to think about careers. So on the screen here, you can see Holland's vocational interests, quite often called the RIASEC model. We love just taking the letters out, making an acronym as academics. So we've got realistic job roles in our vocational interest models. These are very practical things, being a plumber, being an electrician, being an engineer, things like that. Investigative, these are our analytical job roles. So if you were going to be a statistical analyst or a doctor or an architect, or kind of thinking roles, that's in the investigative area. Artistic does what it says on the tin. These are our creative industries. So if you're a musician, an actor, a film director, you're in that area. Social, these are our helping professions. So teachers, nurses, social workers, they all fit within this area. Enterprising tends to be our business area. Marketing managers, estate agents, management consultants, they're all in this. And conventional, this is about our kind of detail-oriented area. So lots of finance falls into here, lots of legal, sort of paralegal stuff comes into here. So we've got different kinds of job roles. And I looked at it at the domain level. If you've got high or low scores on the different domains of psychopathy, does that change what kind of careers you're interested in, what kind of university degree you're going to do, and what kind of jobs you go on to apply for? And it does. So those domains are associated with different things. So typically, overall, our psychopaths are far more interested in our enterprising and conventional careers, less interested in our social careers. But there were some very specific things about the domains that actually worked in really interesting ways. So our interpersonal domain, that grandiose, manipulative, kind of pathological lying set of traits, they are associated with being positively interested in conventional careers. And it was particularly finance that was driving this. They are negatively interested in artistic careers. The higher you are on the interpersonal traits, less interested you are in the creative industries. But if we looked at the antisocial traits, we got the opposite effect. They're more interested in the artistic careers and negatively interested in the conventional careers. So we're going to have different types of psychopaths potentially interested in going into different types of careers. So what can we do about this? I'm going to start out with the bad news. Brace yourselves. There's not any kind of proven treatment for psychopathy. There's no pharmacological treatment we've got available. There are no drugs that are going to make psychopaths better, per se. Our evidence around whether any kind of therapeutic treatment is going to have an effect isn't great either. We've got some very mixed results. A lot of this is done in the forensic sphere with criminals because they're a nice handy population who have to do things to try and get released. But in some of those studies, actually, we had psychopaths who went through a treatment program. It was kind of like a group therapy program, and psychopaths who didn't. And the ones that went through the treatment program were more likely to reoffend when they were released than the ones who didn't. And they thought that actually the group therapy taught them new and better ways of manipulating people. It's frightening, isn't it? Some more recent research is a bit more promising, particularly things that are targeted specifically at psychopaths and young offenders in particular might be better. And we might have a better chance at trying to target factor 2, those lifestyle and antisocial elements. Factor 1 feels like it's a little bit hardwired and difficult to move, but we might get them to change their behaviours and how they actually then operate in society. People who work in business, though, not as handy as criminals in terms of getting them to participate in treatment, because just use your imaginations for a second. Imagine tomorrow you wake up, you think you're fantastic. You don't care what anyone else thinks of you or what you've done. You've got no guilt for anything that you've done. You don't feel anxious about the future, and you're not constrained by any rules. Doesn't that sound great? Do you want to go into treatment and get rid of that? No. Psychopaths are quite often aware that they are dangerous to other people, but it's of great benefit to them. They're life's predators. So actually, in terms of what we can do about psychopaths, it comes down to the potential victims, businesses, and wider society to actually kind of manage this risk mostly. So as individuals, if you're coming into contact with psychopaths, self-awareness is your best friend. So there's a couple of things you want to be aware of. First of all, what are your weaknesses? What are those hotspots that a psychopath can use in order to manipulate you? So for example, if you experience rejection, and therefore if they embrace you, bring you in, include you, are you going to be really grateful then and loyal to them? You also want to be thinking about your role in their game. What are they going to get out of you? And Babiak and Hare, in their book Snakes in Suits, came up with 4 different players in the psychopath's game. And what role you might play, what player you might be, depends on whether you are willing and able to support the psychopath and whether or not you have any kind of power. So if you're a supporter and you've got power, you could be a patron here. So patrons, somebody who can help the psychopath get ahead. They're going to get the full charm offensive. Psychopath can't do enough for them because they really want them to see the best side and to be putting them through succession plans and things like that. If you're a supporter but you've not got that power, you might get a bit of that charm. You might also actually get a bit of the bullying and the more overt manipulation. And rather than them being there, what can I do for you? It's what you're going to be able to do for them that's going to be of interest. You're the pawn. So that report that needs to be on the boss's desk by 9 a.m. Monday morning, that's really boring, psychopath is far too busy and important to write that report. But you as the pawn, oh yeah, your buttons are going to get pushed and you're going to get cajoled into doing that. So you're going to be there kind of doing the dirty work for the psychopath. If you're not a supporter, but you have got power, you could be a problem for the psychopath. You're the organizational police. You could thwart the psychopath's ambitions. They don't want that. So what you might find is that the psychopath goes about actually kind of tarnishing your reputation. They'll want to make sure that should you ever raise the alarm about them, that you have limited credibility, and the patron can step in and defend them, and all is fine with their plans, because they really like power and like to get ahead. If you're not a supporter or you can't support, you've not got the skills to help, for example, and you've not got any power, breathe a huge sigh of relief. This is the best quadrant to be in, really, because you're going to be kind of invisible to our psychopath. You're not going to get charmed, but you're probably not going to get the really nasty side of them either. So you're just going to be in the background. So as an individual, really think about how might you be manipulated, and what is it that the psychopath is going to get from you. If we're looking at what businesses can do, well, first of all, you've got to actually know that there's an issue. And one of the best ways to find that out is with something called 360-degree feedback. So 360-degree feedback is where we get lots of opinions and reports back on people's performance from lots of different stakeholders. So it might be their boss, their colleagues, if they've got subordinates, customers, etc. If you find that somebody is reluctant to participate in 360-degree feedback, if they're allowed to make their own selections of who provides feedback, they choose people that you weren't expecting, not the people that are closest to them, for example, in the organisation. Or, telltale hallmark, if you get really divergent views, if you get lots of people who love them and then lots of people who really hate them, that's a flag to look into this situation a little bit more. You can also work on building a culture in your organisation that's not particularly psychopath friendly. So a culture of accountability where there's consequences for your actions, where there's transparency and honesty, where it's very clear what everybody's doing. Those aren't attractive to psychopaths. Nor is there an ethical culture. They like an ends justify the means culture, where if you hit your targets, if you make a profit, it doesn't really matter how you did it. We're just happy that we've got the money in at the end. That's the kind of culture a psychopath likes and can fit into quite easily. A more ethical culture where we care about how you do things, and they're not as interested in that. And they don't want to work hard. They'll go somewhere where they don't have to kind of show ethicality. If you're a manager, you can try and engage in something called high involvement management. And this is where you're delegating power. So people are deciding kind of how they do their work. You're giving them lots of opportunities for advancement with training, for example. You're keeping them informed of what's going on in the organisation, and you're making it very clear what the rewards are. And it's based on actually helping us to meet three basic human needs. The need for autonomy, we want to feel in control of things. The need for competence, we want to feel like we're good at stuff. And the need for relatedness, we want to feel like actually we're connected to other people. In high involvement management with psychopaths, the manager has got to kind of use these levers to try and encourage the psychopath to behave in ways that benefits the organisation, even when it's not intrinsically satisfying to the psychopath. So autonomy and competence, actually, they quite like both of these things. They don't have any respect for authority, want to be in charge of themselves, and care about career advancement. So they're on board with those things. Relatedness, not so much. They don't really care about being part of a team and helping others. But if you can set up an environment where it's very clear that in order to get ahead in this organisation, you've got to work with others, support them, help them, then you can mitigate against some of those kind of negative effects of kind of not participating in contextual performance or counterproductive work performance. If we've got a leader, then actually we might want to consider bringing in a counter sidekick to them. Sounds like the world's worst job. But you can bring somebody in who can actually make up some of what the psychopath lacks. So somebody who's got that attention to detail, somebody who's very diligent, somebody who's going to think through decisions very carefully. They suggest a productive, obsessive compulsive would be quite useful. So interesting idea there. But it's only going to work if actually this person is really trusted by the psychopath. They're almost seen as an extension of themselves. And the counter sidekick is really sensitive to the psychopath's traits. They know, not to push certain buttons. We could consider therapy, but as we saw at the start, whether that's going to be helpful or not is debatable, or whether they'll even do it. I would urge us to think, though, about traits and not psychopaths as one group, as we saw, because what's going to work in our actually managing psychopaths is going to be very different depending on whether we've got our very charming, kind of charismatic presenting psychopaths, or whether we've got our more overtly antisocial, impulsive psychopaths. So we're going to have to really focus on our transparent culture, our ethicality, making it very clear that supporting other people is part of getting rewarded in our organisation if we've got high levels of factor 1, those interpersonal and affective traits. Factor 2, it's probably going to be more about behavioural controls and that accountability. This is what is acceptable, this is what is not acceptable, and these are the consequences for it. And actually being able to monitor it and follow through with formal processes and procedures. So we've got to think about traits rather than just psychopaths in general. And I'll finish with giving you a question about whether this is actually useful and ethical at all. As sometimes identifying somebody as having psychopathic traits makes us feel better. We can explain that difficult situation, and actually all the responsibility pushes onto that person, actually be victimizing that individual. But at a wider level, that stops us from examining what the systemic issues might be that led to that person actually being able to be in our organisation with us and to enact their traits. So it can preclude us having a wider look there. We might also need to consider whether we are going to fall foul of the Equality Act of 2010 and whether we could be seen as discriminating against psychopaths. So there is no case law as yet, but if we take psychopathy as a mental health condition and the way the diagnostic systems are changing, it's more likely that it falls under this. As an employer, you may have to make reasonable adjustments to allow for psychopaths in your workplace, or you may be accused of discrimination. So there is a caution against actually using the term psychopaths in business. So that is where I will finish my talky bit, and I will hand over to Dominic to chair our Q&A. But thank you very much, everybody, for being such a wonderful audience.
Thank you, Holly. I think you have just opened up a box full of fascinating themes. So we have two roving microphones, one on the left, one on the right. We also have questions online. Obviously, we're live streaming any questions, and that will be recorded. So just that you're aware if you are asking a question. So, are there any questions? Yes, we have one here on the. And then we go into maybe the top corner there.
The pictures in your slides were mostly of men. Does the evidence support that most psychopaths are men? And if so, is there a nature versus nurture reason for that? And how early can you identify a child, for instance, who's got psychopathic traits?
Great question, or questions. I'm going to try and unpack them. Yes, there is evidence that psychopathy is more prevalent in men than women, more than double the prevalence rate in men compared to women. There are potentially some measurement issues that lead to that. Actually, the way that Robert Hare's measurement system was set up was working with prisoners in Canada, most of whom were men. So there's an argument that actually the measurement systems are biased towards the way psychopathy presents in men. And there is some research, there's not a lot of research with female psychopaths, there is some, but it may present in a slightly different way. So for example, rather than the kind of very grandiose presentation that we might see in men in the interpersonal domain, we might see female psychopaths as coming across as more flirtatious, for example. So there's a different presentation. The nature versus nurture thing is fascinating. So there is evidence that psychopathy is heritable. So, I mean, this is amazing that this number of studies even exist, but there are twin studies. So in psychology, I mean, the fact that people study this is questionable empathy and ethicality, but twins who are separated at birth, psychologists dream, because we've got identical nature, but different nurture environments. And there are enough studies of psychopathy in twins that are separated at birth to know that if you've got a twin with psychopathy, you are more likely to also have psychopathy as well. And if we think about it on an evolutionary level, it's a fantastic strategy to perpetuate your genes. So there are two ways of perpetuating your genes as animals. One is a fast reproductive strategy. So think turtles, for example, come up onto the beach, lay thousands of eggs, bury them, leave them there. That's the end of your caregiving. You've covered them with a bit of sand. And, you know, lots of these eggs are not, these little turtles are not going to make it, but statistically, some of them will get through. That's how you perpetuate your genes. Whereas we then got a slow reproductive strategy. So this is most mammals. Anyone who's ever walked a dog across a field with cows and calves will know that mammals are very protective of their young and will stay with them. They'll have far fewer young, they'll raise them until they're able to look after themselves, and that's how they perpetuate their genes. Psychopaths operate a fast reproductive strategy, so they have lots of children and abandon them, but in a species that operates a slow reproductive strategy. So they know that actually they're not leaving it to chance that they're going to survive. Somebody else is going to look after these children and ensure that they survive. So it's a great way of perpetuating your genes. In terms of nature and what impact that has, the evidence suggests that factor one, the interpersonal and the affective traits, those are the kind of bits that are most affected by nature. Those could be actually seen as being the hardwired bits of psychopathy. Whereas the presentation, the lifestyle and the antisocial traits, they can be far more affected by nurture. So if you've got an aversive childhood environment, so you've got abusive parents, you've got parental drug use or alcoholism, for example, you're more likely to be higher in the factor two than someone who hasn't. Hopefully that covered that question. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I'd like to preface this question with, just to make it clear, I'm not an employee of the university and haven't been for a year and a half. So if you were in a situation where you were competing with someone with psychopathic traits or who was somebody who was psychopath, how can you defend against that?
It's very difficult. So some authors are quite pessimistic about this and say, just get out, because you're not fighting like with like. You know, are you going to actually dial up your level of psychopathic traits? And there are some arguments for this. So there's an author, Kevin Dutton, at Oxford University. So Kevin Dutton, if any of you have come across his books, The Wisdom of Psychopaths, and he wrote something called The Good Psychopath's Guide to Success with Andy McNabb, who self-identifies as a psychopath. And Kevin Dutton suggests that actually it can be really advantageous to dial up your psychopathic traits in certain situations. I wonder about that personally. I think there's a difference between kind of dialing up one or two traits. So if the competition, relied on you actually being a little bit more manipulative and a little bit more grandiose, you might be all right to kind of dial those two up a bit in certain circumstances. But if actually you were going to need to dial lots of psychopathic traits up, I think in combination, they're quite dangerous and you might find yourself becoming quite a different person. If you were looking at more benign strategies, avoiding being manipulated by somebody who's psychopathic, you want to avoid one-to-one situations with them. It's much easier for psychopaths to manipulate people individually. So have other people present when conversations happen. If that's not possible, follow up with emails on what's agreed. So, there's no way of them kind of coming back and saying, well, actually, you said you were going to do that, and I've done my bit of the bargain, as they might do. You're also going to want to be kind of making sure that you stay connected to those around you. Psychopaths will create what Babiak and Hare term the psychopathic network. Then they'll kind of pull on all these strings to make what they want happen. So you want to be able to actually keep in touch with everybody, have that level of honesty and transparency with those around you, so you can actually share what's going on and you can see what's happening. If they're telling one person one thing and somebody else something different, you spot that. Psychopaths like to create a lot of conflict so that people don't talk to each other and they don't kind of see what's happening under the surface. Stay plugged in with the office grapevine. What's going on, what gossip is there, to find out actually what's happening, and try and be as squeaky clean as you possibly can. But they are difficult people to deal with, absolutely.
We have one question online, and then I come to you.
Yeah, we've had some good questions coming in from the live stream audience. What we wanted to ask particularly is about your research into businesses, and does the history of business actually indicate that the negative traits of psychopaths can create success which outweigh that?
So, are there also successful outcomes?
Yes.
Yeah, we tend to see that more with narcissistic leaders. Psychopathy being the darkest of the dark, it is generally associated over time with negative outcomes. But that ability to take risks can pay off. So they tend to take, as leaders, bigger risks. And if that works out, that's big payoffs. There's a paper about narcissistic leaders called The Incredible Highs and the Inevitable Lows that kind of refers to this. But certainly short term, and we know that psychopaths tend to kind of move on quite quickly. They kind of do their bit, manipulating people, get what they want, and before they get found out, they'll move on to something else. So, if they move quite quickly, they might leave actually some successes there. But unlike our Machiavellians and narcissists, who generally seem to actually, be all right at doing their jobs, they've certainly not got the same kind of negative relationship with performance that psychopaths have. Psychopaths aren't really doing their job very well. They're creating conflict with other people, which is bad for performance, and they're not making terribly great decisions all of the time, or they're very risky decisions. So, not so good.
Question at the top there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fascinating stuff. I spent 50 years in business, split between first half was in corporates, the second half was actually consulting, supplying into corporates, helping people, startups, all that sort of stuff. But I had one specific time, immediately after I left corporate land, to join a small company built around one guy who was a psychopath.
absolutely 100%. I didn't realise it at the time, but increasingly I became to realise it. I found it fascinating. For example, the board of the corporates, working with a psychopath was fascinating. So you say, don't go on a one-to-one. Well, kind of, you can shield yourself. It is really interesting. But just two things that I remember so distinctly when I'm listening to you. One is that as the company became more successful, we floated, more people joined the company, he became increasingly paranoid. Absolutely paranoid. He was projecting all those characteristics, virtually every one of those characteristics, but he had every one of them. And my daytime was spent in the office, my night time spent joining him a couple of hours later in his home to essentially go through what everybody had done, who was plotting against him, who was trying to steal the company from him in whatever way. Extreme paranoia based on this projection of every one of these bad qualities. Second thing I remember, which was, I find it still extraordinary thinking back on it. Each time I left him at around about 11 o'clock at night, I thought, well, he needs to go into rehab. He needs to go lie down for 3 months. We will not see him the following day. But he would come back in. He would come back into the office, not normal time. He'd come back at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, create havoc in the office. But he would be absolutely normal. It's as if the previous night had never happened. They have a resilience, this massive resilience, which if I'd been doing what he was doing, I would have needed to go on holiday, take a rest. With him, it was just like another night, as if it never happened. The resilience that they have because they don't have those emotions.
Yeah.
It's just extraordinary. For normal people, it is unbelievable until you see it. And you think, right, good, he's away for some time, or he'll be worrying, or he'll be ruining that decision. Not a bit of it. They're just back to normal, back to where they were, with all those problems. And it can be a nightmare.
Yeah.
Or it can be very interesting.
I hope you were getting paid well for all this, evening counselling.
It was household name. He was in the papers so much. Obviously, I'm not naming his name, but I knew he was a con man. And extraordinary. He's still very successful today. But that company, within 6 years, that company went bankrupt with the result of the way he managed it.
There you
Holly's
go.
just about to update the slides there with a few new.
I know, I was all geared.
Do we have another final question?
Thank you.
You just in the second row there. Yeah, you do.
Hi. Thank you for your fascinating presentation. I was thinking, I was already thinking about it, but the gentleman brought up the fact that it's mostly men that seem to be using examples. We think about, losing equity, for instance. I would have thought that's a classic case of psychopathy. But what I was thinking about it when it came out in papers is the fact that isn't the organizational culture also not rooting it out? So in terms of people being hesitant, I know I should have said something, I know I should have done better, and then you have to almost come to the point of whistleblowing, before you can root it out. So I just wondered if you could talk about, can you help us think about how do you root it out and how do you report and you successfully report on this sort of culture rather than just, I suppose, being fascinated about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and female psychopaths. You mentioned Lucy Letby, often seen as more horrifying in their crimes. So even when you match the crimes of female psychopaths to the crimes of male psychopaths, they'll often be sentenced much more harshly for them because what they do is so out of line with what we expect in kind of maternal caregiving. Traditional roles that women are expected to play. It's quite a shock when they don't play that. Great question about what we can do as organizations. I think it is about creating that culture, but I think as well about understanding how psychopathy might influence people in an organization. So it's a kind of bad apples versus bad barrels kind of argument. Is this just one person? it comes back to our nature versus nurture. One person who's joined this organisation, and yes, they're going to wreak havoc in it, but they're not going to affect everybody else. Or do we have to take this more seriously? And some of our research suggests that actually there is a cascade effect, particularly when you've got people high up in an organisation with high levels of psychopathy, that then negatively affects their interactions with their top management team, which makes the top management team more in conflict with each other, because they're not in a psychologically safe environment. They're worried about what the boss is going to say or do to them. So they're all in conflict with each other, which then negatively impacts actually how they're interacting with the workforce, which makes them all more kind of high in conflict, lower performance, more counterproductive work behaviours. If we feel like we've got a really negative environment at work, we tend to try and kind of balance out the bad stuff by perhaps putting less effort in, or taking that bit of stationery out of the stationery cupboard. Well, I deserve it for what I've had to put up with at work today. I'll have that pack of pens, thank you. So we tend to see that cascade. So we've got to be really aware of who is at the top and what the ethical culture is. If we've got an organisation, we need a clear whistleblowing procedure. So I think aviation is great for it. It's kind of whistleblowing. Well, it's not really whistleblowing, but it's reporting culture. So every near miss that happens in aviation is reported so that we can learn from it. We don't try and cover these things up. Whereas in other organisations, you get a near miss, you go, whew, thank God I don't have to tell anybody about that. And we never learn from it. Interestingly, the NHS, years ago, I spent some time working with somebody who'd just taken over as kind of chief executive officer of an NHS trust in London. And he inherited an executive team that his predecessor had put through Machiavellian training. I kid you not. So the NHS at his spouse's care and looking after other people, he was getting advice about what does he do now with these people that have been taught kind of use manipulation tactics, get what you want from others, ends justify the means. So yeah, it's sometimes not surprising that organisations that we think of as being caring, that are under real pressure, have kind of resorted to these kind of cover-ups and haven't got that open ethical culture, because everybody's overworked, underpaid, scared for their livelihood.
Thank you, Holly. I think that brings us to the end of the evening today. And before I ask you to join me in thanking Holly for both her presentation, but also I think the really engaging and thoughtful answers to your questions. Just a brief look ahead to what else is coming in the program. So this was it in terms of the lectures for this term, but our semester. But in the spring we will be back, and we will share this on the details on the events page soon. We have the Winter Festival coming up next week. It says here we bring a sprinkling of magic across our community. I can't promise that, but I can promise carols. And finally, that's on the 28th of November, next Thursday. And finally, we will be next Friday holding our flagship event for Disability History Month. I think it's done at the Merle, and that is a whole afternoon from 12 to 5 of events and presentations. So who's interested, there are more details on the website. But can I just say thank you all for attending. I think have a good and safe trip back home. And please join me in thanking Holly for the message.
Thank you. Thank you. Don't have nightmares, anyone.